There's a very specific moment worth understanding in detail. The moment a genuinely healed empath, someone who's actually done the work we've discussed throughout this entire series, finds herself face to face with a narcissist again. Maybe it's the same person from her past, resurfacing after months or years of silence. Maybe it's someone entirely new, exhibiting the same familiar patterns she once couldn't recognize until it was too late. Either way, this moment reveals something important, both about how much has genuinely changed in her and about how completely different this encounter looks compared to every version that came before it. Let's start by understanding why this moment matters so much as a genuine test, because it's worth being honest about something important. Healing that's never actually tested against the specific thing it was built to withstand remains in some sense theoretical. You can do enormous internal work, build genuine boundaries, rebuild genuine self-trust, and still not fully know how solid that foundation actually is until it encounters the exact conditions it was designed for. This is what makes the moment we're describing today so significant. It's not simply another difficult experience to survive. It's the actual, practical demonstration of whether everything discussed throughout this series has become genuinely integrated or whether it remains still more intellectual understanding than lived, embodied reality. Here's the first thing worth understanding about what actually happens in this moment, because it tends to surprise people who expect something more dramatic. Recognition arrives almost instantly, and it arrives calmly. This is worth contrasting directly with what recognition used to feel like earlier in her journey, when she was still learning to identify these patterns for the first time. Early recognition often came with a rush of anxiety, sometimes even a physical response, a racing heart, a flood of uncertainty about whether she was reading the situation correctly, whether she was being paranoid, whether her perception could actually be trusted against someone confidently presenting a different version of reality. Recognition after genuine healing looks and feels almost nothing like this. It arrives quietly, almost matter-of-factly, the way you'd recognize a familiar shape from a distance without needing to examine it closely to be certain of what you're looking at. This shift is worth understanding at a deeper level because it reveals something significant about what healing actually changes. It isn't that she's become better at analyzing behavior in real time, running through a mental checklist of red flags while the interaction is happening. It's that the pattern recognition has become genuinely automatic, integrated at a level that no longer requires conscious analysis to access. The incongruence between words and tone, the subtle testing of boundaries, the specific quality of charm that used to feel flattering and now simply registers as familiar, all of it gets processed instantly, without the effortful, anxious deliberation that used to accompany this exact same recognition earlier in her healing. Here's the second thing worth understanding about this encounter, and it's genuinely one of the most significant markers of authentic healing: the absence of the old physiological activation. Earlier in her journey, even after developing real intellectual understanding of narcissistic patterns, encountering one in person often still produced a specific bodily response. A tightness, an anxious alertness, sometimes even something close to the old conditioned reactions from her previous relationship. This is worth understanding as completely normal for that stage of healing, not evidence that the work wasn't genuine. Intellectual understanding and nervous system recalibration develop on different timelines, and it's entirely possible to understand a pattern completely while your body still responds to it as though it's dangerous in the old conditioned way. What's different in this later encounter is that this physiological activation has genuinely, substantially quieted. This doesn't mean she feels nothing at all. Some alertness, some heightened attention remains appropriate and even useful, a healthy response to encountering a pattern that genuinely can cause harm if she's not paying attention. What's different is the absence of the old, disproportionate anxiety, the racing thoughts, the sense of being destabilized simply by being in the same space as this kind of energy. Her nervous system, having done the genuine work of rebuilding safety and stability from an internal source rather than an external one, no longer treats this encounter as the kind of threat that requires full-scale activation to survive. Here's the third thing worth understanding, and it's perhaps the most practically significant marker of genuine healing available in this exact moment. She notices the familiar tactics being deployed. The mirroring, the flattery calibrated to reach exactly what would have worked before, the testing of small boundaries to see how much give exists, and she watches them land on nothing. Not because she's performing indifference or working hard to resist their pull, because the specific vulnerabilities these tactics were designed to exploit have been genuinely, structurally addressed, which means there's simply nowhere left for them to actually take hold. One of the clearest signs that an empath has genuinely healed isn't found in what she says during the encounter. It's found in what she no longer feels obligated to prove. Earlier in her journey, meeting a narcissist again often created an almost irresistible need to explain herself. She wanted to correct the false narrative. She wanted to finally be understood. She hoped that if she could simply find the right words, the other person would eventually recognize the truth of what had happened. That impulse is remarkably understandable. When someone has spent months or years questioning their own reality, being believed can feel like the final piece of healing. But genuine recovery quietly changes the purpose of conversation. She no longer enters the interaction hoping to change another person's perception. Instead, she pays attention to something much more reliable: behavior. This shift deserves careful examination because it fundamentally changes the emotional balance of the encounter. The narcissist may still present the same carefully constructed version of events. They may minimize the past. They may casually rewrite history. They may speak with complete confidence, expecting that confidence alone will create credibility. Years earlier, this might have triggered hours of self-doubt. She would have replayed every sentence afterward, wondering whether she had misunderstood, overreacted, or remembered things incorrectly. Now something entirely different happens. She notices the contradiction. She acknowledges it internally, and then she lets it remain exactly where it belongs with the person creating it. That ability represents far more than emotional restraint. It represents restored trust in her own perception. Another important change becomes visible in this moment. She no longer mistakes emotional intensity for emotional significance. Many unhealthy relationships create the illusion that strong emotions automatically indicate deep connection. Arguments feel passionate. Reconciliations feel extraordinary. Periods of silence make every reunion seem meaningful. The entire relationship begins alternating between emotional extremes. After healing, that emotional rhythm no longer feels exciting. It feels familiar. And familiarity changes everything. She recognizes that constant unpredictability isn't evidence of love. It's often evidence of instability. Instead of feeling pulled toward the emotional highs, she begins appreciating something she once overlooked: consistency, calm communication, predictable respect, steady behavior. Those qualities may appear less dramatic. Psychologically, they create far greater security. This transformation becomes especially noticeable if the narcissist attempts to recreate the original dynamic. Perhaps they begin with excessive charm. Perhaps they remind her of happier memories. Perhaps they subtly suggest that nobody has ever understood them the way she did. Years earlier, these conversations might have awakened hope. Now they awaken observation. She isn't asking herself, could this finally be different? She's asking something much simpler. Has the pattern actually changed? Notice the difference. Hope searches for possibility. Wisdom searches for consistency. Consistency can only be measured over time, not through promises, not through emotion, not through chemistry, only through repeated behavior. This is why genuine healing often appears surprisingly uneventful. There is no dramatic confrontation, no desperate attempt to expose manipulation, no overwhelming desire to win the conversation. Instead, she quietly notices what is happening. She responds only when necessary, and she refuses to participate in dynamics that once consumed enormous amounts of emotional energy. There is another subtle but important difference. Earlier in life, she often believed compassion required unlimited access. If someone was struggling, she felt responsible for helping. If someone was hurting, she assumed staying was the loving choice. Healing doesn't remove compassion. It adds discernment. She can recognize another person's pain without accepting responsibility for resolving it. She can understand someone's history without excusing harmful behavior. She can wish another person well while simultaneously deciding they no longer belong in her life. Those ideas once felt contradictory. Now they coexist comfortably. Perhaps that's the greatest evidence of growth. She no longer experiences every difficult choice as a conflict between kindness and self-respect. She has discovered that healthy love requires both. And because of that discovery, something remarkable happens during this encounter. The narcissist may be exactly the same person they have always been, but the relationship can never become what it once was, not because the narcissist has changed, because she has. The patterns that once depended on confusion now meet clarity. The tactics that once depended on self-doubt now meet self-trust. The emotional hooks that once found open wounds now encounter healed boundaries. And when those conditions disappear, the old cycle quietly loses the power it once held. That is why seeing a narcissist again after genuine healing isn't primarily a test of whether they have changed. It's a quiet confirmation of how profoundly you have. There is one final change that brings everything together, because it reveals the difference between someone who has simply escaped a narcissistic relationship and someone who has genuinely healed from it. Earlier in life, every encounter with the narcissist felt like a question. Do they still have power over me? Will they apologize? Have they changed? Did they ever truly love me? Every interaction seemed to demand an answer. Healing quietly changes the question itself. Now she asks something entirely different. How do I feel in my own body while I'm here? That may sound like a small shift, but psychologically it's enormous, because her attention is no longer centered on analyzing another person's behavior. It has returned to the one place it always belonged, her own experience. She notices whether she feels relaxed or tense, whether she feels respected or diminished, whether the conversation creates clarity or confusion. Those observations become far more important than any explanation the narcissist offers. Another remarkable difference begins to appear. She no longer mistakes familiarity for compatibility. This is one of the most powerful changes genuine healing creates. The nervous system often becomes accustomed to emotional unpredictability. Intense chemistry begins feeling normal. Calm relationships can even feel unfamiliar. Earlier in her journey, she might have interpreted that emotional intensity as evidence of a rare connection. Now she recognizes it differently. She understands that anxiety and attraction are not the same emotion. She understands that constantly trying to earn consistency is not love. She understands that peace is not boring. Peace is what healthy attachment feels like. That realization changes every future relationship. There is another quiet moment that often happens during these encounters. The narcissist may attempt to remind her of who she used to be. Perhaps they bring up old memories. Perhaps they refer to the version of her that always forgave, the version that always stayed, the version that constantly explained herself. For a brief moment, those memories may still exist. Healing does not erase history. It simply changes its influence. She remembers the woman she used to be with compassion instead of shame. She no longer criticizes herself for loving deeply. She understands that her kindness was never the mistake. The mistake was believing kindness alone could transform someone who refused to take responsibility for themselves. That distinction removes an enormous amount of guilt. Perhaps the greatest surprise comes after the conversation ends. Years ago, she would have replayed every sentence. She would have analyzed every facial expression. She would have wondered whether she said too much or too little. She might have carried the encounter with her for weeks. Now something completely different happens. She walks away. She returns to her life. She continues working, laughing, seeing friends, planning the future. The conversation occupies minutes instead of months, not because it wasn't important, because it no longer defines her emotional world. That may be the clearest evidence of genuine healing. The narcissist has become one experience among many, not the center of her identity. There is one final truth worth remembering. Many people believe healing means becoming impossible to hurt. That isn't realistic. Healed people still feel disappointment. They still experience sadness. They still care deeply. The difference is that they no longer abandon themselves in order to preserve another person's comfort. They don't silence their intuition to avoid conflict. They don't negotiate away their boundaries to keep someone from leaving. They don't confuse endless patience with unconditional love. Instead, they trust themselves, and self-trust changes everything. Because once you genuinely trust your own perception, manipulation loses one of its most powerful tools. Once you trust your own boundaries, guilt becomes much less persuasive. Once you trust your own worth, approval becomes a gift instead of a necessity. If today's conversation leaves you with one idea, let it be this. What happens when a healed empath meets a narcissist again isn't that the narcissist suddenly becomes powerless. It's that the old version of the empath no longer exists. The person who once searched desperately for validation has learned self-respect. The person who once confused potential with reality has learned discernment. The person who once feared walking away has discovered that peace is worth protecting. The narcissist may repeat the same patterns, the same charm, the same excuses, the same emotional tests, but they meet someone fundamentally different, someone whose compassion now includes herself, someone whose boundaries no longer require permission, someone who understands that real love never asks you to lose yourself in order to keep someone else. And that is the quiet transformation every healed empath eventually discovers. The greatest proof of healing isn't that you defeat the narcissist, it's that when you meet them again, you no longer need to. There's another subtle transformation that often goes unnoticed because it doesn't create dramatic moments. In fact, from the outside, almost nothing appears to happen at all. The healed empath stops feeling responsible for another person's unfinished emotional work. Earlier in life, this responsibility often felt completely natural. If someone was hurting, she believed she should help. If someone became defensive, she searched for gentler words. If someone withdrew emotionally, she assumed she needed to become more patient. Without realizing it, she slowly accepted responsibility for emotions that were never hers to manage. That pattern disappears after genuine healing, not because she becomes less compassionate, because she finally understands the difference between compassion and responsibility. Compassion allows you to recognize another person's pain. Responsibility requires you to carry it. Those are not the same thing. When she meets the narcissist again, she may still recognize the insecurity beneath the confidence. She may still notice the loneliness hidden behind the constant need for admiration. She may even understand exactly why certain defensive behaviors developed in the first place. But understanding no longer creates obligation. She doesn't mistake insight for assignment. She knows that recognizing someone's wounds does not mean sacrificing herself to heal them. That realization creates an extraordinary kind of emotional freedom. Another quiet change becomes visible in the way she experiences silence. Years ago, silence felt frightening. If the narcissist stopped calling, she wondered what she had done wrong. If messages went unanswered, anxiety quickly filled the empty space. Her imagination worked overtime trying to solve problems that often didn't exist. Now silence feels completely different. Silence no longer demands interpretation. It doesn't automatically become rejection. It simply becomes silence. That may sound insignificant, but psychologically it represents profound nervous system healing. The absence of contact no longer feels like the absence of worth. Her value is no longer measured by someone else's attention. That inner stability changes every interaction she has, not only with narcissists, but with everyone. Perhaps the most beautiful transformation appears in what she chooses to notice. Earlier, she focused almost entirely on whether another person loved her enough. Now she pays attention to whether the relationship allows her to remain herself. Can she speak honestly? Can she disagree without fear? Can she maintain her boundaries without guilt? Can she feel emotionally safe? These questions create entirely different relationships because they begin with self-respect instead of self-sacrifice. And finally, there is one moment that often surprises healed empaths the most. They realize they no longer want revenge, not because what happened was acceptable, not because they suddenly excuse the betrayal, but because they understand that remaining emotionally attached through anger still keeps part of their life organized around the person who hurt them. Real freedom feels different. It isn't proving who was right. It isn't waiting for karma. It isn't hoping the narcissist finally understands what they lost. It's waking up one ordinary morning and realizing they no longer occupy your emotional landscape the way they once did. Your future has become more interesting than your past. Your peace has become more valuable than your explanations. And your own life has become more deserving of your attention than the person who once consumed it. That is the quiet destination genuine healing was leading toward all along. Not becoming emotionally harder, but becoming emotionally free. Thanks for watching.